my mom stole from me for years and thought she'd get away with it. So this is a story I never thought I'd be telling, but here we are. You know that moment when you finally think you're in the clear? When you've worked your butt off, done everything right, and you're finally on the verge of getting out of a bad situation, only for someone to pull the rug out from under you. Yeah, that happened to me. For some quick context, I'm Sam, 20F, and up until recently, I thought I had my future all lined up. I'd worked nonstop through high school, landed a full sports scholarship, and was ready to head off to college and leave behind the train wreck that was my home life. But, of course, my mother had other plans. She always has other plans. See, my dad passed away when I was little, so for a long time, it was just me and my mom. And let's just say we were never that mother-daughter best friends duo. She always had this vision of the kind of daughter she wanted: girly, delicate, obsessed with fashion and social status. And me? I was the exact opposite. Things got even worse when I was 16 and she remarried. That's when my stepdad Mark and his then 15-year-old daughter, Riley, entered the picture. And let me tell you, that girl was the golden child from day one. She wasn't just favored, she was worshipped. Riley got everything she wanted. She had my mom and Mark wrapped around her little finger, and no matter how entitled or downright nasty she was, she could do no wrong. Meanwhile, I was just there, an afterthought. It was obvious from the beginning that my mom preferred Riley over me. She doted on her, spoiled her, and made sure she always had the best of everything. And me? I was just expected to deal with it. But the real kicker? That came on my 18th birthday. I should have known the day was going to be a disaster when it started with absolutely nothing. No birthday wishes, no dinner plans, no acknowledgement whatsoever. My mom barely looked at me. Mark and Riley didn't even bother pretending to care. I had long since stopped expecting grand gestures, but I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd at least get a happy birthday. Instead, my mom pulled me aside for a serious conversation. At first, I thought it was about college. Maybe she wanted to talk about finances or how I'd be managing things on my own. Wrong. Because instead, she sat me down and told me that now that I was an adult, it was time I started contributing. Not to rent, not to utilities, not even to groceries. No, to Riley's college fund. I actually laughed at first because I genuinely thought she was messing with me. But she wasn't. She went on to explain that since Riley wasn't a student athlete like me and her grades weren't good enough for a scholarship, she would have to pay full tuition. And since my tuition was covered, it was only fair that I started pitching in. And then she dropped the real bombshell. If you refuse, you're not welcome to live here anymore. I just sat there, stunned. I asked her to repeat herself because surely I had to be misunderstanding. But no, she doubled down. In her mind, I was so lucky to have a scholarship, which meant I wasn't paying for my education. So why wouldn't I help? Why wouldn't I give back to my family? Those are her words, not mine. At that moment, something inside me just snapped. I wasn't her priority. I never had been. She had chosen Mark and Riley over me a long time ago. I had just been too stupid to see it. And now? Now, she wasn't even hiding it anymore. So I didn't argue. I didn't scream or cry. I just nodded and said, I need some time to think about it. Then I went in my room, locked the door, and started planning my exit. My mom and Mark both work in high-paying medical jobs. She's a nurse, and he's a pediatrician. They make plenty of money. There was absolutely no reason they needed financial help from me. This wasn't about money. This was about control. They saw me as an easy target, the responsible one, the girl who never caused trouble, the one who always handled things on her own. They figured I'd be so desperate to stay in their good graces that I'd just give in. Not. I was going to fight back. And I knew exactly where to start. Not with my mom. She never listened to me anyway. I was going to go to the only people who had real power over her, my grandparents. There was just one problem. My mom had spent years keeping me away from them. She always had an excuse. They were too fragile to be burdened with my problems. They were old-fashioned and wouldn't understand. She controlled when I visited, what I could tell them, how much they knew. And now, I was finally asking myself why. What was she hiding? Why did she work so hard to keep them at a distance? And more importantly, what would happen if they finally learned the truth? I had a feeling my mom had spent years lying to them, and I was about to expose every single one of those lies. But before I went to them, I needed proof. Solid proof. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I recorded my mom. I walked back into the living room, sat down, and, without her realizing, started recording our conversation on my phone. Then I asked her to repeat everything she had said earlier. And she did. She laid it all out, again, with that same arrogant certainty. I needed to contribute to Riley's future. If I didn't, I could pack my bags. She had no idea she was giving me the exact evidence I needed to burn her entire plan to the ground. That evening, I told her I was going out with friends. Instead, I went straight to my grandparents' house. And when I told them everything, including playing the recording, all broke loose. Let me tell you, my mother had no idea what was coming for her. Driving to my grandparents' house that night, my hands were shaking not with fear, but with pure adrenaline. I had no idea how this was going to go. For years, my mom had controlled the narrative, spinning whatever story she wanted. She always made sure I had limited contact with them, keeping them just close enough to maintain appearances but never close enough to know the full truth. And now, for the first time ever, I was about to break that cycle. When I pulled into their driveway, I sat in my car for a second, trying to steady myself. My grandparents had always been kind to me, but they were also traditional, the type of people who believed families should always stick together. Would they even believe me? Would they care? I didn't have a choice but to find out. The moment my grandma opened the door and saw me standing there, her face immediately shifted from surprise to concern. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here so late?" she asked, ushering me inside. "Is everything okay?" I took a deep breath. "No," I admitted. "It's really not." I walked into their living room, the familiarity of the space bringing back memories of when I was little, back when I actually felt like I had real family. My grandpa sat in his usual chair, peering at me over his reading glasses. "All right," he said, setting his book down. "Tell us what's going on." I didn't waste time. I told them everything. I told them about the years of favoritism, about how Riley was treated like royalty while I was barely acknowledged. I told them how my mother had spent years keeping me at a distance, feeding them lies and half-truths while she built her perfect little life with Mark and Riley. And then, I told them about the real reason I was here. I pulled out my phone, pressed play, and let them hear for themselves. My mother's voice filled the room, clear as day. Every cruel, heartless word. Every demand. Every ounce of entitlement as she declared that I was financially responsible for Riley. I watched as my grandmother's expression hardened, her hands tightening around the armrest of the couch. My grandpa, normally a quiet man, was shaking his head, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might snap a tooth. When the recording ended, silence hung between us. Then my grandma let out a slow breath and said, "That woman has lost her damn mind." For the next hour, my grandparents ripped my mother apart. They weren't just angry. They were furious. Apparently, my mom had been feeding them lies for years. She told them that I was doing great at home, that Riley and I were like sisters, that they had supported me financially through school, and that I was grateful to be part of a blended family. I almost laughed. Grateful? I was barely tolerated in that house. But the worst part? She had also been taking money from them. My grandmother stormed off to dig through her records, and when she came back, she had receipts, literal receipts, of thousands of dollars they had sent my mom over the past few years. For emergencies, my mother had claimed. For Sam's school expenses. All lies. The money had never been for me. It had been for Riley. I felt my stomach twist. Not only had my mother stolen my future, but she had been using my name to milk money out of my grandparents, money that was meant to help me. I had expected them to be disappointed, maybe even heartbroken. What I hadn't expected was my grandpa standing up, grabbing his car keys, and saying, "We're going to your mother's house." Now, I won't lie. Watching my grandparents storm into my mom's house like a pair of avenging angels was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. My mom was sitting in the living room with Mark and Riley when we arrived. The second she saw us, her face went pale. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" she asked, forcing a nervous laugh. My grandpa didn't even give her a chance to play dumb. He slammed the stack of receipts onto the table, crossed his arms, and said, "Explain this." The next 10 minutes were absolute chaos. My mom stammered, tried to deny it, then tried to spin some pathetic excuse about how she was just trying to give both her daughters equal opportunities. Mark jumped in, insisting that it's not that big of a deal, that I was young and capable, while Riley needed more support. And Riley? She just sat there, silent. For once in her life, she had nothing to say. My grandmother, who had been letting my grandpa handle most of the yelling, finally spoke. And when she did, her voice was ice cold. "We have given you everything, and this is how you repay us," she said. "By lying? By stealing? By turning your daughter into a second-class citizen in her own home." She shook her head in disgust. "You should be ashamed of yourself." I had never seen my mother look so small. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any more intense, my grandpa turned to me and said, "Pack your things, kid. You're coming home with us." My mom's head snapped toward me. "She has a home here," she argued. My grandpa laughed. Actually laughed. "No, she doesn't. You made sure of that." My mom sputtered, looking to Mark for backup, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at Riley, who was still sitting there, eyes wide like she couldn't believe this was happening. I didn't hesitate. I went in my room, grabbed everything I could fit into my bags, and walked out without looking back. And just like that, I was done. That night, as I settled into my old childhood room at my grandparents' house, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. No more walking on eggshells. No more being treated like an afterthought. No more feeling like I was just waiting for the next time my mom chose Riley over me. And the best part? My grandparents weren't done yet, because the next morning, they called their lawyer, and my mother was about to lose a whole lot more than just me. Waking up in my grandparents' house the next morning felt like coming up for air after being underwater for years. For the first time in forever, I wasn't waking up to tension, to feeling like I had to fight for space in my own home. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen, I realized the fight wasn't over yet. My grandpa was already on the phone, his voice sharp, the way it only got when he was dead serious. My grandma sat at the table, arms crossed, her expression stormy. The tension in the air was thick, and when my grandpa finally hung up, he looked straight at me. "That was our lawyer," he said, voice calm but firm. "Your mother's about to learn what consequences feel like." See, what I didn't realize at the time was that my grandparents had been helping my mom financially for years, but under the condition that a portion of the money was meant for me. They weren't just handing her money to burn on Riley. They were under the impression that some of it was going toward my college savings, my expenses, my future. And now, after hearing that not a single cent had actually gone to me, they were livid. That morning, my grandpa set up a meeting with their lawyer to discuss pulling every single penny they had been giving my mom. Any savings, any family support, gone. But they weren't stopping there. My grandma, ever the meticulous one, had been keeping records of everything. Every wire transfer, every check, every conversation where my mom had promised that the money was being used for my benefit. And now, they had enough proof to take legal action. I wish I could have seen my mother's face when she got that phone call. I didn't hear from her directly, of course. She didn't have the guts to call me herself. Instead, I got a furious voicemail from Mark. "You have no idea what you've done. Your mother is in tears. You turned her own parents against her. Are you happy now?" Oh, I was more than happy. But the best part? That wasn't even the worst of it. Later that afternoon, I got a text from Riley. Now, Riley and I hadn't spoken since I left. She had been silent during the entire confrontation. But now, for the first time, she had something to say. "I hope you're satisfied. You ruined everything. You took away my college fund." I read the text twice, blinked, and then laughed out loud. She really thought I was the villain here? I fired back a response. "You mean the money that was stolen from me in the first place? The money my mom manipulated out of our grandparents by lying? That college fund?" Her response was immediate. "That's not the point. You didn't have to involve them. You could have just figured something else out." Oh, right. I should have just rolled over like I always had. Like she expected me to. I didn't even bother responding. For once, it wasn't my problem. By the end of the week, my grandparents had completely cut my mother off. Every financial safety net she had? Gone. She and Mark would actually have to figure things out for themselves. No more using me as an excuse to siphon money from my grandparents. But karma wasn't done yet. Because it turned out, my grandparents weren't the only ones my mother had been lying to. A couple of days later, my uncle, my mom's older brother, called me. Now, my uncle had never been directly involved in the mess that was my mom's life. He lived out of state and only came around for major holidays. But apparently, he had also been giving her money. Why? Because she told him I was struggling financially and that she was helping me stay afloat. She played the worried mother act perfectly, told him that she was sacrificing so much to make sure I had everything I needed for school, that she just needed a little extra help every now and then. When my grandparents told him what really happened, he lost it. I swear, my family's group chat exploded that night. The entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, all found out. And the reaction? Brutal. My mom had spent years carefully crafting the image of being a selfless, devoted mother. Now, everyone knew the truth. She was a liar, a manipulator, and worst of all, she stole from her daughter. I didn't hear from her again for a while. Not a call, not a text, not even a passive-aggressive email. It was bliss. Until, one evening, a letter showed up at my grandparents' house. From her. I opened it, half expecting it to be some dramatic sob story, begging for forgiveness. It wasn't. Instead, it was a pathetic attempt at guilt-tripping. She wrote about how I had humiliated her, how I had turned the family against her, how she hoped I was happy now that I had taken everything from her and Riley. She ended it with a single sentence that honestly made me laugh out loud. "One day, you'll regret this." I stared at those words for a long moment before tossing the letter into the trash. Because the truth was, I had never felt less regretful in my life. For the first time, I was free. No more expectations. No more manipulation. No more being treated like an afterthought in my own home. I had a real family now. My grandparents, who actually loved and supported me. A future that was mine, not something my mother could control. And my mom. She was finally facing the one thing she had spent her entire life avoiding. Consequences. And let me tell you, it was beautiful to watch. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living under my mother's control. No more guilt tripping. No more being forced into a role I never agreed to. No more sacrificing my future for a family that never saw me as an equal. And honestly, it felt incredible. But, of course, my mother wasn't the type to go down quietly. After the letter failed to manipulate me, she took things up a notch. That's when the random relatives started reaching out. It started with a call from my Aunt Linda, one of my mom's cousins whom I barely spoke to. The moment I answered, I could already hear the judgment in her tone. "Sam," she started, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I heard about everything going on with your mom. She's devastated. She really thought you two had a stronger bond than this." I had to stop myself from laughing. A stronger bond? The woman practically treated me like a tenant in my own house. And now that she lost her gravy train, she was heartbroken? "Linda," I said evenly, "did my mom tell you why I left?" A pause. Then, a careful, "Well, she said there was a misunderstanding about money." "Oh, of course. A misunderstanding. That's what she was calling stealing my college savings and lying to my grandparents to milk them for money." I exhaled slowly. "Did she also tell you that she was forcing me to pay for Riley's tuition? That she told me to either contribute or get out?" Silence. I continued. "Did she tell you that she was taking money from Grandpa and Grandma under the pretense that it was for me? Or that she was lying to Uncle John for even more cash?" The silence stretched. Finally, Aunt Linda cleared her throat, her tone much more hesitant now. "She may have left some of that out." "Yeah, no kidding." "Well," I said, my patience gone. "Maybe next time she wants to play the victim, she should tell the whole story." And with that, I hung up. A few days later, a new wave of messages came in. This time, the guilt-tripping kind. "Sam, I know your mom made mistakes, but she's still your mother. You only get one family. I just think it's really sad that you turned your back over something as petty as money. You have every right to be upset, but at some point, you need to be the bigger person." Ah, yes, the classic be the bigger person speech. As if I hadn't already spent my entire life being the bigger person. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I screenshotted every message and sent them directly to my grandparents. They went nuclear. That evening, my grandpa called a family meeting. Now, to give you some context, my grandpa is not the type of man you ignore. When he calls a meeting, people show up. So that's how I ended up sitting at my grandparents' dining room table, watching his aunts, uncles, and cousins filtered in one by one, all looking slightly nervous. And then, finally, my mom walked in. She looked terrible. Eyes puffy, hair a mess, her usual confidence completely gone. She saw me sitting there and immediately went into her usual act, the heartbroken mother routine. "Sam," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Sit down," my grandpa interrupted, his voice like steel. My mom flinched. I had never seen her look so small. Once everyone was seated, my grandpa did not hold back. He laid everything out. Every lie. Every manipulation. Every stolen dollar. He told them about the money she took, the way she lied to the entire family, how she had been using me as a pawn to keep herself financially secure. It was brutal, and she had no defense. Every time she tried to speak, my grandma would just hold up another receipt, another bank statement, another piece of evidence that proved she had been lying through her teeth. By the end of it, even her most loyal supporters had nothing to say. And then my grandpa delivered the final blow. "You are no longer welcome in this house," he said, voice cold. "And you will never receive another penny from us again." It was over. My mom was cut off. And just like that, the family she had spent years manipulating wanted nothing to do with her. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. But I also knew this wasn't the end. My mom might have lost her financial safety net, but she wasn't the type to just disappear. She would try something else. Whatever it was, I needed to be ready. Because if there was one thing I had learned, she would never stop trying to get control back. For the first time in my life, my mother was completely powerless. No more money from my grandparents. No more manipulating me into giving her what she wanted. No more control over my future. She had lost everything. And you know what? She deserved it. But if I thought she would just sit back and accept her defeat, I was wrong. A few days after my grandparents cut her off, I got a message from Riley. We hadn't spoken much since I left, but now, out of nowhere, she was texting me. Her message was blunt. "Did you hear what she's doing?" Confused, I quickly responded, asking what she meant. A couple of minutes later, my phone rang. It was Riley. I hesitated before picking it up. I wasn't sure if this was just another way for her to guilt-trip me. But the tone in Riley's voice when she started speaking immediately caught my attention. "She's suing Grandpa and Grandma." I didn't know what to say. "Wait, what?" "She's suing them for emotional distress, claiming they manipulated you against her and that she's owed compensation for the damage." I was stunned. It didn't make sense. Was she actually trying to sue her parents for cutting her off after everything she had done for them? After everything she had done to me? Riley seemed just as disgusted as I was. "She's completely lost it," she said. "Dad's furious too, but he's just staying out of it." I took a deep breath. "Does she have any chance of winning?" Riley scoffed. "Not a chance. But you know her. If she can create a big enough scene, she'll think she can force them into giving her money again." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was beyond petty. But it wasn't over yet. I decided to confront my mother. It wasn't just the lawsuit. She had to know I wasn't going to let this slide. When I called her, she didn't answer right away. So, I left a message. "Mom, I know about the lawsuit. You're wasting your time. And if you think this is the way to fix everything, you're even more delusional than I thought." The response was as expected. She didn't call back. But a few hours later, I got a voicemail. This time, it wasn't the desperate, emotional speech I had expected. Instead, it was pure deflection. "I'm doing what I have to do to protect myself. You may not understand, but you will one day. It's not about the money. It's about respect." I almost threw my phone across the room. Respect? She had never respected me. She spent years ignoring me, treating me like a financial backup for her selfish decisions. And now, she was acting like she was the one who had been wronged? I couldn't even listen to her anymore. But it was when I checked my email the next morning that I realized she had escalated things further. There it was, sitting in my inbox, an eviction notice from my mother. She was trying to evict me from my grandparents' house. I blinked, reading the email over and over again to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Her plan was clear. Since I had decided to cut ties with her, she thought she could take the next step and kick me out of my only safe space. I immediately called my grandparents, my heart racing. My grandma picked up, and before I even said anything, she knew. "We got the same notice," she said. "Your mother thinks she can do whatever she wants, doesn't she?" My mind was racing. I wasn't sure if I should laugh, cry, or just call her out on it. Instead, I said calmly, "I won't let her control me anymore. I won't let her drag me into another one of her schemes." "Don't worry, sweetheart," my grandma reassured me. "This is her mess, and she's going to have to deal with the consequences of it. We've got your back." But something told me this wasn't over. No, this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, my mother didn't make direct contact with me. Instead, she sent a series of messages to the family. She tried to spin the whole thing in her favor, claiming that I was being manipulated by my grandparents and that I was making a huge mistake by cutting ties with her. She even dared to say that I was ruining our family. But the best part? No one believed her. Every single one of my relatives who initially sided with her had started to turn their backs. They saw the evidence. They saw the lies. They saw how much she had taken from me. They all had their own private moments of realization. But the most satisfying moment came when I got a call from my uncle. He had always been close to my mom, but once he heard about the eviction notice, the lawsuit, and everything in between, he finally saw her for who she truly was. "I can't believe I didn't see it sooner," he admitted, voice thick with regret. "Sam, I'm sorry. I should have done something. Your mom's behavior, it's just not right. I'm done waiting for her to change," I said firmly. "I don't need her approval. I don't need her guilt trips. I'm moving on with my life." And that, more than anything else, felt like the real victory. My mom was no longer part of my world. And it was the best decision I had ever made. Cutting my mom off was supposed to be the final step, the clean break I had been waiting for. But, of course, she wasn't the type to go down without dragging everyone else down with her. After the failed lawsuit and the failed eviction stunt, you'd think she'd have learned her lesson. She didn't. Instead, she went nuclear. The first sign that something was off came when my job called me in for a meeting. I worked part-time at a local gym while finishing school, and up until that point, I had never had any issues. My boss was great, my schedule was flexible, and it was one of the few things in my life that felt stable. So when my manager pulled me aside one afternoon, looking uncomfortable, I knew something was wrong. "Sam," he started, hesitating. "We got a complaint." I frowned. "From who?" He sighed and slid a piece of paper across the desk. We got this email from someone claiming to be your mother. I picked it up, scanning the words. My stomach dropped. In the email, my mother had written a long, dramatic message about how I was an unstable and unreliable employee, how I was stealing from family, and creating problems wherever I went. She tried to get me fired. I set the paper down, taking a deep breath. You don't believe any of this, do you? My boss shook his head. Not at all. I just wanted you to be aware that this is happening. If she keeps harassing the workplace, we can file a complaint. I exhaled slowly, my fingers curling into fists. Was she really this desperate? I nodded. Thank you for letting me know. I'll handle it. And by handle it, I meant shut it down for good. I went home that night and blocked her email. Then, just to be sure she couldn't pull this stunt anywhere else, I preemptively warned my school and any other important contacts. By the time I was done, she had no direct way of reaching me. But she wasn't finished yet. A few days later, my grandparents' house got a visit. From Child Protective Services. Yep, you read that right. She filed a false report against my grandparents, claiming they were unfit to have me living with them and that I was in a dangerous situation. It was beyond disgusting. The investigator showed up one morning, completely unaware that the entire complaint was based on lies. My grandpa, who had always been a calm and level-headed man, was furious but composed. We have nothing to hide, he told them. Feel free to look around. The CPS worker went through the house, saw that everything was fine, and left within 20 minutes. It was so obviously a false report that they didn't even bother following up. But the damage was done. My grandparents, two of the kindest, most supportive people I had ever known, had been humiliated. My mother had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And that's when I realized. She wasn't just desperate. She was dangerous. I knew I couldn't ignore her anymore. She had escalated to a level that could have had real consequences if CPS had believed her lies. So I did something I had never done before. I called a lawyer. My grandparents were fully on board. They had already spoken with their attorney about taking legal action against my mom for harassment, false accusations, and defamation. And as for me, I was filing for a restraining order. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting myself and the people I loved. When my mother found out, she lost it. She tried to call me blocked. She tried to message me blocked. Then she went to Riley. And for the first time in her life, Riley chose me over her. I was at home when I got the call from Riley. She sounded different, tired, defeated, but also done. I just wanted to let you know, she said. I'm moving out. I blinked. What? I'm done with her. I'm moving in with Dad. I can't take it anymore. I didn't know what to say. Riley had always been on my mom's side, whether actively or passively. She had never stood up for me, never stood against her. But now she was running too. She tried to get me fired, Riley admitted. After you blocked her, she turned on me. She told my boss that I was stealing. When that didn't work, she threatened to kick me out unless I cut off contact with Dad. I exhaled slowly. Are you okay? She let out a humorless laugh. No, but I will be. For the first time, she understood. She understood what it felt like to be used. To be treated like a pawn instead of a person. She understood why I had left. Why? I had never looked back. A week later, the restraining order was approved. My mother was officially barred from contacting me, showing up at my workplace, or attempting to involve me in any of her schemes. I expected her to fight it. She didn't. Instead, she finally went silent. For the first time in my entire life, she had no control over me. And for the first time in her life, she had no one left to manipulate. The silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. For years, my mother had controlled my life with guilt, manipulation, and entitlement. Every decision I made, every step I took, she was always there, looming over me, finding new ways to make sure I knew my place. But now, she had nothing. No more control. No more money. No more me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for the next fight. Because the fight was over, I stayed with my grandparents, and life finally started to feel normal. No random phone calls. No desperate texts. No sudden demands that I sacrifice my future for someone else's. Just peace. I kept expecting her to pull something new, some last-ditch effort to regain power over me, but nothing happened. She had burned every bridge she had, and now she was alone. And honestly, that was her ult. A few months passed before I heard anything about her again. This time, it was from Riley. She had officially cut ties with my mother and was living full-time with her dad. And now, she was seeing my mother for exactly who she was. I don't know how you dealt with it for so long, she admitted one night over the phone. It's like she doesn't even care about people, just what they can do for her. I didn't say anything because what was there to say? I had known that for years. But for the first time, Riley finally understood. She lost everything. You know, she continued. She's renting some tiny apartment now, barely getting by. No one in the family talks to her. She's completely isolated. I won't lie. There was a part of me that wanted to feel bad. But I didn't. Because she did this to herself. Actions have consequences. She chose to lie, steal, and manipulate for years. She chose to treat me like I was disposable. And now, she was paying for it. The last time I ever saw her was purely by accident. I was at a coffee shop, grabbing my usual, when I spotted her across the street. She looked different. Older. Tired. Like someone who had lost a war she thought she would win. For a split second, our eyes met. I expected her to come over. To try one last time to guilt me, to beg for help, to play the victim. But she didn't. She just looked at me, eyes unreadable, then turned and walked away. That was it. No dramatic speech. No last-minute apology. That was all I needed. I built a new life after that. One that didn't revolve around her. I finished school, got a job I loved, and built real relationships with people who cared about me. And the best part? I didn't have to constantly look over my shoulder, waiting for my mother's next move. And I won. Not in the way she always framed things, not as a competition, but in the way that mattered. I was happy, and I didn't need her at all.